Bueno, para finalizar nuestro seminario vamos a tener una conferencia magistral, debate sobre uno de los temas estructurales que más impacto tendrá en la economía en el mediano o largo plazo, que es el cambio climático. Este diálogo va a ser moderado por nuestro vicerrector, el doctor Alejandro Hernández. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Mene. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Pues en esta ocasión decidimos hacer algo un poco diferente en este seminario de perspectivas económicas e incluir un tema que es fundamental, pero que si bien no necesariamente incide en las perspectivas económicas de 2023, sí es algo que debe, desde luego, requiere de toda nuestra atención. Y pensamos que es importante aprovechar este espacio de comunicación con nuestra comunidad de exalumnos y amigos de la institución, un poco para poder traer a la mesa o a la conciencia de todos lo que nuestra profesión, nuestra disciplina está contribuyendo a este tema. Entender, todos sabemos de la importancia del cambio climático, pero realmente cuál es su magnitud, cuál es el costo, cuál es la efectividad de las diversas políticas que se plantean para combatir esto. Así que bueno, creo que es un momento muy interesante y realmente además es sumamente emocionante para mí en lo personal, para el ITAM, porque ha sido la oportunidad también de traer a este evento a quien sin duda es nuestro exalumno con la carrera académica más brillante en la historia del ITAM, Esteban Rossi-Hansberg, quien en los últimos años ha escrito una serie de artículos seminales fundamentales precisamente sobre este tema. Así que sin más, déjenme dar inicio y presentar a Esteban. Esteban Rossi-Hansberg es alumno de Economía del ITAM, doctor en Economía por la Universidad de Chicago. Él ha sido profesor americano. Ahora es nada menos que Glen Lloyd, Distinguished Service Professor de la Universidad de Chicago. Él es también un investigador asociado al National Bureau of Economic Research y al Center for Economic Policy Research. Y es codirector del International Economics and Economic Geography Initiative del Becker Friedman Institute de la Universidad de Chicago. Es fellow de la Sociedad Econométrica, es miembro de la American Academy of Arts and Sciences y desde hace un año es editor nada menos que del prestigiosísimo Journal of Political Economy. Esteban, es realmente un placer tener. Ahí no termina lo bueno. Antes de darle la palabra a Esteban, déjenme presentar a quien va a participar también en esta discusión, que sin duda una de las figuras más prominentes de nuestra profesión hoy en día. Me refiero al profesor John Cochrane. John Cochrane, actualmente Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow de Hoover Institution, ubicado en la Universidad de Stanford. El profesor Cochrane ha sido profesor por muchos años en la Escuela de Negocios de la Universidad de Chicago, la Booth School, y ha sido una figura prominente en cuestiones de asset pricing, de mercados financieros. Fue uno de los líderes detrás de la convocatoria y finalmente el reporte del famoso Squamble Report, en donde presentó las nuevas recomendaciones de rearquitectura del sistema financiero después de la crisis de 2008. Y el profesor Cochrane no solo es un experto en temas financieros, en realidad es un economista renacentista, digamos, a través de diversos medios, de sus editoriales, de su blog, el famoso Grumpy Economist. Constantemente está dando importantes puntos de vista sobre temas, incluyendo el cambio climático y otras medidas que también están influyendo, como es todo el tema de el mundo. Así que it's a pleasure having you with us. It's really a privilege. Thank you so much. On behalf of all our community, we really thank you for being with us. Vamos a tener esta conversación en inglés en consideración del profesor Cochrane. So, let's get started. Esteban, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Alejandro. And it's a pleasure to be here. ITAM is my alma mater, the place where I first learned anything about economics. And it has been with me throughout. And, you know, the friendship of Alejandro and the support of ITAM, Arturo, has been really important in my career. So thank you so much for everything. And it's, of course, a pleasure to be here with John, who is one of the greats in our profession. So what I want to do today, I'm going to stand, is talk about my work on climate change. And this is work that I've done throughout, you know, multiple papers, different years, with a number of co-authors that are listed there. Does this thing work? Ah, beautiful. Okay, so, you know, this is a summary. I'll try to, you know, not go into a lot of very technical details, but instead kind of give you a sense of what are the main implications of this agenda and kind of the gist of the approach that we're taking. And so, you know, the starting point is climate change is happening. It will be hard to stop anytime soon. The policy and the policy consensus that is required to put in place the policies that we would need to stop it are just simply not there so far. And so what we are going to have to do is we're going to have to adapt to minimize its costs. And the basic kind of issue there is that climate change is going to affect different regions of the world, different parts of the economy very differently. And so that's going to imply that there's going to be winners and losers. Some places are going to be better off as a result of climate change, as far-fetched as that may sound, given what we hear, you know, in the media, etc. Some places are going to, or our calculations clearly say that some places are going to be better off. Some places are going to be worse off, of course. And so the fact that there's going to be winners and losers implies that, you know, a lot of the adaptation is going to happen by moving people and resources, investment from certain sectors, certain locations into others. And how costly that process is determines in a crucial way the cost of climate change and the cost of the whole phenomenon. And so these frictions depend on the cost of moving people, in particular, the cost of moving goods based on trade, and changes in the cost of changing specialization in particular locations of the world. Now, to think about this, to design the policies to improve this adaptation, to design the policies that can help us try to prevent some of the worst consequences of climate change, we need frameworks that incorporate the key aspects of this phenomenon, in particular frameworks that are global, because this is like global externality. We cannot really, you know, look at it just from one particular location. We need frameworks that are dynamic because it's going to happen many decades, centuries over time, and we need the spatial heterogeneity that I was talking about. And so that's what we try to do. We try to develop these type of frameworks, and it's very important when you think about these frameworks, not only to have this spatial heterogeneity, but also to build frameworks that are behavioral frameworks. And what I mean by that is frameworks in which there's individuals, firms that are making explicit decisions about where to be, how much to produce, what to invest, what type of sectors to produce in, rather than simply do empirical extrapolations of what we've seen so far. Why? Because, you know, we're going to be in a new reality, and this is over long periods of time. So this is really kind of a topic in which we want to put everything we know about the economy, right, to try to think about how the economy in the future is going to look like and how climate is going to affect that economy in the future. And so we've done some of that. I mean, there's obviously lots to do. And these are models that generate, and so what I have in this slide here, generate, you know, the evolution of CO2 emissions, evolution of global temperatures, you know, that are roughly in line. I mean, when this is partly, you know, the design, the type of parameters that we're using in the model that are roughly in line with what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, has predicted for the worst scenarios that they put out. And now, so this is kind of the overall effect on temperature, the overall effect on emissions, but of course, you know, these changes in temperatures, as I mentioned, have very heterogeneous effects across locations of the world. And there's two main reasons why these effects are so heterogeneous in space. One is that a 1 degree increase in temperatures, global temperatures, has very different implications on local temperatures. And so what I have in the map that you see there is the temperature scalar. So what's the, how much does temperature increase in a particular location in the world if global temperatures increase by 1 degree Celsius. And so you can see that in some places, that's about 2 in the northern latitudes over there. In some of the blue areas in that map, it's about a half. And so that's a big difference in terms of what's the effect of 1 degree Celsius increase in different parts of the world. So that's one of the big sources of heterogeneity. The other big source of heterogeneity is that, of course, it's very different if your location is very cold to get it a little warmer than if your location is very warm to get it a little warmer, right? It's much worse for production, for amenities, if temperatures increase in places that are already pretty warm. And so what we've done is we've estimated some of the damage of temperature, or some of the effects of temperature on productivity and amenities to try to estimate what these effects are. And so these are estimates that are very complex, and there's a lot that goes into exactly how to do that and what are the outcomes over which you want to calculate this. That is, when you calculate the effect of temperature, is the effect of temperature on what, right? And so in these graphs that I have here is the effect of temperature not on outcomes, not on output or population, but on what I'm going to call fundamentals like productivity or amenities, which are already adjusting for the fact that when, say, productivity changes, people and firms are going to react as a result of those changes, right? And so that's already taking into account that effect. And so if you do that, what you find is that these type of figures here. So on the x-axis, what we have is the temperature in winter, so January in the northern hemisphere, July in the southern hemisphere, and so the places on the part of the x-axis on the left are the coldest places in the world. On the right are the warmest places in the world, and you can see the damages. So what this tells you is, well, if you have 1 degree Celsius increase in the coldest places in the world, what that number is positive, so that tells you that increases productivity in those places. And so that's the good part of the story. Now, of course, you see the other part of the story as well. That is, if you increase 1 degree Celsius temperatures by 1 degree Celsius in the warmest places in the world, then you have some large negative effects on productivity as well. And on the other graph shows you the same for amenities. So there's this concept of amenity that we use a lot, which is, what is the quality of life? How attractive is a place as a location, as a place to live, right? It's going to be affected by that temperature, and that graph measures by how much that would be affected. And so you see very similar type of pattern in that graph. Now, of course, one other thing that you see there is the large confidence intervals around these estimates. So that tells you also, we can estimate some effects, but there's a lot of uncertainty around the precise numbers that we're getting. What we are more confident about, though, is that there's some places where there's going to be positive effects and some places where there's going to be negative effects. Now, you can put it all together and then think about, well, what's going to be the overall impact in terms of present discounted value on real GDP or on welfare in the world? What's the distribution of that impact? And so if you focus on the map in the top right, what you see is the welfare effects. You see the blue areas in that map, Central Africa, parts of South and Central America, the Southeast Asia, are the places that are going to be affected the most. The welfare effects in those places are of the order of magnitude, according to these calculations, of 10–12%. In the other places, there's some places that are winners of the process. Those are all the red areas in the north of the world. And then you see kind of the rich world there. The rich world, the US, Europe, Japan, etc. Those are kind of at the cusp, right in between the areas that win and the areas that lose. And so those are the places that in some sense is going to be that relevant for the wealth. Mexico, in particular, is a little bit below that. So that means that, you know, parts of Mexico are going to be affected. I amplified the effect for Mexico on the PDB of real GDP, and you see that, you know, some parts of southern Mexico are going to be quite affected in terms of real GDP, but parts in the north much less so. So again, that's going to generate migration from the southern parts of Mexico, or one adaptation mechanism as a result of that, migration from south of Mexico, Central America, to parts of central Mexico and northern Mexico. Of course, sorry. Okay, so thank you. Okay, and so those are kind of the net effects, right? And so one of the implications of these net effects is that you know, because the poorest areas of the world, those blue areas that I was referring to, are the most affected, and that some of the rich countries are affected less, and some of these northern latitude are winners. You know, the implication is that inequality or regional inequality is going to grow as a result of this as well, right? So as you're affecting the poorest places the most, right? And so you can see that in this graph, where we have real GDP per capita on the x-axis, and then kind of the relative effect of having a world with climate change relative to without, and you see that the positive slope already tells you that there's going to be an increase in inequality as a result of this. Okay, so again, there's lots of uncertainty about this, and this is kind of highlighted, I guess, in the graph that you see on the left, where, you know, on average, the 95% confidence interval that we have is either zero losses or losses of about 20% by over the next 150 years. Now, this is, of course, huge confidence interval for the average. So we're very uncertain about exactly where the level is going to be. We're less uncertain about the distribution of the costs, like who's going to lose the most, who's going to lose the least, and kind of the range of that distribution. And so that's part of the adaptation response is going to come from those relative effects rather than the level effects. And so we're more confident that those are going to be important implications of this phenomenon. Okay, so that's kind of the evaluation part, if you will. And then there is the question of, okay, what to do about it, right? How can we use this to think about policy? And so carbon policy is obviously the first instance for economists. This is putting a price on carbon or putting some sort of restriction on emissions has been kind of the main policy lever that the world has used, and the main agreement there is the Paris Agreement. And so one of the things that we've done is we've taken the pledges of the Paris Agreement and convert those into, you know, price equivalents or tax equivalent, carbon tax equivalents, and then think, well, what's the effect that these pledges are going to have in terms of reducing climate change or achieving, you know, the 2%, 2-degree goal over pre-industrial levels? And our results at least say very small effects of this. You can see the graphs there. It essentially tell you how, you know, the full Paris Agreement would shift these curves. And it's tiny, it's very small effect overall. If you really want to use carbon pricing to stop this phenomenon and achieve these goals by 2050 or 2100, you need way more aggressive policy. And so you can see that in the table there. It depends a little bit on the parameters that you use in the model. The key parameter there is the elasticity of substitution between, you know, clean energy sources and oil or other fossil fuel sources. But you can see the type of taxes that we're talking about. But if you want to, you know, limit the temperature increases by 2100, you would need like 500% taxes with an elasticity of substitution that is kind of what we use, which is about 1.6%. So those are big numbers. And there's a big question whether we want to kind of use that type of strategy and really increase prices of carbon as much to try to prevent this, because this is going to really disrupt the economy if you suddenly put 500% tax on carbon. Okay. And then there's the question of, well, what's the policy disagreement across locations in the world? Is there any way that the world is actually going to get together and say, well, you know, this is a big enough problem. Let's impose these big taxes that we need in order to do this. And so for that, one way to do that is to calculate what sometimes is called the local social cost of carbon, meaning what is the cost of carbon that a particular location would like to impose kind of globally, right? And so that's what I have in this map. Now that's very related to this welfare cost that we were talking about before, right? But it's not only that welfare cost, because of course the marginal utility of income, how you transfer that welfare into income, and therefore into how much you're willing to pay in order for that not to happen, varies across locations in the world. In particular, in rich countries, it tends to be lower than in poor countries. And so that is, or another way of saying the same thing, is relatively cheaper to increase welfare in poor countries than in richer countries because they are poor. And so that gives you a map that you know, puts the US, Europe, Australia, some of the rich countries as more willing to participate in this and more willing to do more effort on climate change because those local social costs of carbon are larger. But still, the heterogeneity across locations in the world is huge. And one thing that is not so promising is that the global average, which is kind of the global social cost of carbon, what you know the optimal policy would tell you you should set, is above the median of that local social cost of carbon. So if this was just, let's just vote, right? You're not going to get the consensus towards or in favor of the global social cost of carbon or policies that implement that. So the game, if we're not going to get there, the game is going to be adaptation. And so adaptation has, we find that two forms of adaptation are crucial. First one is migration. In the baseline case that I showed you before, about 600 million people are going to migrate or are going to be in the different location than they would otherwise be as a result of climate change in the next 150 years. And so that's a big number. Now, of course, one big issue with that is that the reaction is going to be, well, let's close borders, let's make migration more restrictive. And the question is, what's the effect that that's going to have on the cost of climate change? So what this exercise does is ask exactly that question. If we do that, who's going to suffer and how much bigger are the losses from climate change? And this tells you that if migration costs go up by about 25%, the losses from climate change are about 1/3 larger as a result of that. And so that's kind of a relatively big elasticity, meaning migration is an important adjustment, and we really don't want the world to react to the migration flows that we're going to see as a result of that by making migration more difficult. That would make the cost a lot bigger, and in particular, it would hurt places like Central Africa and Southeast Asia. And then finally, you know, there's also another form of adaptation is to change specialization. And the reason why and that links to the role that international trade has on all of this. And what's the link between international trade and climate change is that, you know, temperature changes, flooding, different types of consequences of climate change are going to have more of an effect on certain sectors than on others. For example, agriculture, you know, is more affected, is more sensitive to temperature than manufacturing. And so what that does is that when certain places get warmer, that's going to change the comparative advantage of certain regions of the world relative to others. Now, when your comparative advantage changes, but you still want to consume the same basket of products that you were consuming, the way you do that is by trading, right? And so trade and low trade costs allow you to change specialization more easily. And so that's the way in which trade is essential as a form of adaptation to climate change. And what we're finding in this work is that trade is a substitute for migration. So if migration is a problem, you know, we're going to see bigger restrictions to migration as a result of the climate flows that we're likely going to see as a result of all of this. You know, we at least want to keep trade free because trade is a substitute for that type of adaptation. Okay, so this gives you a little bit of a flavor of what we're doing. There's many more things that we're thinking about this, and there's, of course, this is a big agenda that has many things that need to be perfected and improved and calculated better. So, so this is an ongoing effort. So what are the key takeaways in what I told you? It's happening, so we need to prepare for it. It's gonna, apart from the overall, price tag that I was giving you, this is gonna change the spatial distribution of economic activity, some of the specialization patterns, and we don't have the policy in place that is gonna stop that. So this is probably gonna happen, and we need to simplify adaptation, right? We cannot just focus on policies to prevent. We also need to focus on policies to adapt, right? And reduce this type of spatial frictions that are costly or making that type of adaptation more costly. And of course, keep reminding you that there's a lot of uncertainty about what we're saying. And so all of this comes with big standard errors. And I guess a grain of salt as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esteban. So now we'll move to listen to John's comments and his own views on climate change. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I hope you can see my slides. I'm a recovering business school professor. I can't go anywhere without slides. It's a real honor. Thank you for having me here. I'm not a real climate economist. I read about it passionately and comment on it, but I don't do it like Esteban does. And it's an especial honor, therefore, to be here with Esteban, who I don't think his introduction was quite glowing enough on just what a fantastic work he's doing, the top work on economics of climate change, which I'll try to persuade you is the central question about climate change. I also want to apologize that I'm not there. I wish I were able to travel, but hopefully sometime soon. And I also want to apologize for doing this in English and not Spanish, but we do what we can. So I think I'm going to organize my comments about what is the question to which climate policy is the answer, which turns out to be a difficult search. And in many ways, this is a background to what Esteban said rather than criticism, because everything he said is great. So I'll try to tell you why it's important, sort of the introduction. Let me start with just a quick background on the science. My theme is that the science is not what we should be arguing about. The economics is what we should be arguing about. The Earth is warming and the sea level is rising, although a lot less than you might think. And most of that is due to human carbon dioxide. Let's not fight about that. That's pretty much a scientific fact. It is not true, however, most of what you read in the newspapers, that I struck out the old words and put in the new words. We used to call it global warming, then climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency, climate catastrophe. It is not true that this is an existential threat to life on Earth. It is also not true that extreme weather, floods, fires, and so forth are a current calamity. This is deep. Maybe they'll change in the future, but right now that's not going on. I brought along some great graphs from Steve Koonin on this. The greatest precipitation days, the frequency of hurricanes on the bottom, and the area of forest fires. I live in California, so every time there's a forest fire, everyone says, this is climate change. No, this is not climate change. These get a Pinocchio. I hope you'll recognize our old friend. The number of deaths from natural disasters across the world is declining quickly. Because people are getting wealthier and therefore able to protect themselves more. Sea level rise has been going on in hundreds of meters for 10,000 years. The magnitudes are millimeters per year, a meter in 100 years maybe. People don't stand still for 100 years while the sea level rises a meter. Climate economics is the central uncertain issue involving all of this. Now, of course, I'm an economist, Esteban's an economist, so economics is the most important question, right? But I think this is objectively true. Relative to the meteorological uncertainties, the question, what are the costs? And as Esteban showed you, the benefits to many people, Canadians ought to be cheering, of climate change. That central question, everything else depends on that number. Is this good? Is it bad? How much does it cost? Second, what are the costs and benefits of policies that might help climate change? And what else might we do with the money? Economists will always tell you opportunity cost is what matters. That is really the central question to everything else. Now, I'm open to the environmental case that this is not about GDP. This is about saving the environment. This is a purely environmental thing that we ought to be willing to spend money to help. But that case is not made in any of the scientific reports. You know, the same way like air pollution is bad because it's bad, not because it lowers GDP. That case has not been made for climate. The uncertainty of this economic cost dwarfs the meteorological uncertainty. And I think that's where we ought to focus our attentions. And people fight about, you know, is climate change real or not? As if it were, we have to go all Greta Thunberg. We don't. That is the question. Now, the typical answer here is about 0 to 5% of GDP 100 years from now. Some more, some less. But this is, we don't have to use decimal points. Even 10% order of magnitudes, and all my points will go through. Now, the problem is 5 or even 10% of GDP 100 years from now is tiny relative to growth and development. I have here GDP per capita in the US. 100 years ago was 10,000. Now it's 60,000. That's a 600% increase in the last 100 years. And we're worrying about 5 to 10% in the next 100 years. That's just nothing compared to growth, the big thing of our world. I made this graph just to dramatize that. Here's $60,000 US current per capita GDP. Suppose it grows at 2% per year. Then 100 years from now, our great grandchildren, instead of 60,000, will have 440,000. Pretty good. In fact, why are we saving money now so they can be even richer? If growth is only 1%, though, that's only 163,000. And if it's 3%, it's over 1 million. And those are sort of where growth could or could not go, I think, in most. That's kind of the uncertainty we have about long-run growth. Climate change, subtract 5% off the, 5% of GDP in the year 2100. That's the little green line. Barely distinguishable. That's 2.5 years worth of growth. That's a big recession. That's not good, but it's not the end of the world, and it's not the central issue of the year 2100. It's worse if you look across countries. Here I have the US, 69,000. I'm kind of mixing up sources here, sorry. Relative to the UK, about 50,000. The difference in US and UK is 8 times the damage of climate change. Now, the UK, well, you might like it or might not like it, but it's not, if climate change is an existential threat, moving to the UK is not an 8 times existential threat. Mexico is about 20,000, about equal to China. India is about 7,000. If the question is GDP in the year 2100, especially if the question is the GDP in the year 2100 for Mexico or for other countries, growth, development, not climate, is the screaming answer. And we don't have to argue about decimals. There's by factors of 100. In addition, only wealthy countries can care about carbon dioxide and do something about it. The number one thing to do about climate change is to let them grow. Indeed, much of the climate policy we talk about assumes that the poor will always stay poor and promotes policies to keep them there. So really, if the question is, how do you raise GDP in 2100? Climate change is a tiny thimbleful in that drop in the rising ocean of that question. And we pretty much know where growth comes from. This is the famous plot of North versus South Korea. A wonderful controlled experiment, not wonderful, a disastrous controlled experiment. And let me give you a hint. It's not because it's hotter in North Korea. This is a plot of GDP per capita on the Ease of Doing Business report. Notice the immense variation in GDP per capita across countries, and it correlates pretty well with all the standard things. And those things are not temperature. Next, what is really this number? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? If we're going to think about climate, that is, as I said, the central issue. How do we get at the central issue? I want to take you a little bit in the weeds. Esteban said, this is very complicated. But we need to understand where numbers come from and not just their black boxes. So how do we approach this question? Well, the first thing you can do is kind of add up from model, think about the economy and how does it from fundamentals. The problem with that is you get very small answers, like 2%. And there's a reason. Modern industrial economies just don't care that much about weather. Agriculture is a tiny proportion of the economy, and it's going to do fine. And the 2100 economy, the knowledge economy, the service economy is likely to care even less about temperature. Second approach, statistical. Let us find, instead of trying to figure out what the economy looks like 100 years from now, let's look at the correlation between temperature and productivity now and use that to project the effect of temperature and productivity in the year 2100. Now that problem one, as you saw, there's a huge variation in income completely unrelated to weather. 99% of the variation across places in how productive they are is from something else and not the weather. So you're looking for a tiny needle in a huge haystack. Problem two, Miami, sorry for using US examples. I'll get it wrong if I try to do Mexican examples. Miami, 25 degrees in January, is 22.5 degrees hotter than New York, 2.2 in January. This is enormous compared to the 1 or 2 degrees we're talking about with climate change. And Miami has hurricanes, it's 2 meters above sea level. New York has the amenities and Miami has alligators. Yet the US is moving from New York to Miami as fast as it can. Productivity is higher in Miami than New York right now. In the summer, it's hot. In the winter, it's cold. Productivity doesn't change that much. Problem three, a lot of these regressions have wild misspecification. I read a Nature article that really got me mad recently. The author ran GDP growth rate on the temperature level, multiplied a tiny coefficient by 100, and got huge numbers. Guys, you don't run GDP growth on temperature level, and that got published in Nature. Into this fray comes the state of the art. Esteban, congratulations. This is a wonderful job of doing it. What does Esteban do? Controls for innovation, migration, trade, local natural attributes, year, region, fixed effects, and regional time trends to try to get out the 99% of everything else that's affecting productivity. And here's, again, this beautiful graph of the result. Now, Esteban's central point, which I'm not going to talk about, some gain, some lose, regional heterogeneity. 100% we have to think about this. And I just, for reasons of time, I won't talk a lot about it. Esteban did, however, find a large 10% overall effect. Now, even though this is the state of the art, we need to look in and be a little critical. For example, Miami, the number says that 25 degrees, 1 degree extra temperature lowers Miami's productivity, if I read the graph right, 15%. Miami is pretty bad. San Antonio is worse. Is it really 15%? That's a big number. And as usual, now I could put everyone to sleep. You have to understand of any regression what all the controls are doing. What are the fixed effects doing? Where is the source of variation? What is the actual? The story is not Miami versus New York, because we have fixed effects, regional time trends, controls for amenities, and so forth. So I think there's reasons to be, even though this is the state of the art, one can be a little skeptical. Rather than be econometric, I want you to think about the daring thing that Esteban is trying to do as best as we possibly can. Suppose we send Esteban back in a time machine to use data from 1823. Esteban does 200 years, more than 100, which I really approve of. Let's not get focused on 100 years. 1823 or 1923 to think about the climate sensitivity in 2023. And I put down, just to remind you, what the world was like in 1823, what the economy was like in 1923, and what they thought 20 to 23 was going to look like when it finally came around. You recognize this would have been a fairly hopeless exercise. The Esteban of 1923 would have completely missed economic growth, the massive technical change, not the fact about adaptation, but what adaptations had. In particular, air conditioning. Esteban 1923 would have said the South is completely hopeless. The South of the US is completely hopeless. It's hot, it's muggy, it's full of diseases, it's full of bugs. It's just a terrible place to do anything, because they didn't know that air conditioning was going to be invented. Diseases like malaria were going to be conquered. Hybrids and GMO crops that could grow in bad places would be. There's just no way to know. So I would add it, how do you know that we economists have a sense of humor? Because we use decimal points. Now, I'm not being critical. This is excellent. This is the state of the art. This is way better than the article in Nature that we just criticized. But we have to recognize the state of the art is pretty raw, unlikely to get better soon. And do we really want to spend $1 trillion? Now, let me move on to what to do about it. Let's think about policy for climate change. The 21st century carbon dioxide is all about China, India, and Africa. China is building a coal-fired power plant every week. Whether we subsidize Teslas for my neighbors in Palo Alto is completely irrelevant to the question of climate change. The US and Europe are actually going down thanks to fracking and natural gas, which really brought down our emissions. I really love, Esteban has taught me some amazing things, revelations. The first is a carbon tax. I was a good Chicago economist. Carbon, externality. What do you do with an externality? Tax the externality. Carbon tax, next question. Until I read Esteban. Let me draw you to this, this curve here. Here is what happens to carbon dioxide emissions, and here it happens to global temperatures if we add 50%, 100%, and 200% carbon taxes. What happens is you slightly delay the release, and you slightly delay the warming. You do not eliminate the warming. And the reason is crystal clear. Esteban is a natural resource extraction model. You extract things and then you stop, then the price goes up and it's worth extracting more stuff. All the carbon taxes do is make it a little more expensive, so it makes it today cost what it will cost 10 years from now to extract the oil. Eventually it all comes out. It takes 1,000 years to get out of the atmosphere. All a carbon tax does is delay. If you think this is the end of the world, this is save Mother Gaia, this is the end of life on Earth, delaying it 10 years is essentially worthless. That was boom. To me, the carbon tax is in fact not the answer. The only way you actually reduce temperatures is if it stays in the ground for 1,000 years. Worse, subsidies. I'm mad about subsidies. I live in Palo Alto, which is very expensive neighborhood. My neighbor just got a big tax credit to buy a Tesla. He's a middle-aged man, wants his fancy car, and taxpayers supported that sort of thing. Green subsidies do essentially nothing, which is the centerpiece of US carbon policy. Now, why does it do essentially nothing? One of the best stories I can tell you is that if you subsidize electric cars, all that does is free up gas, which someone else will use, and the gas then gets burned. What we are doing with subsidies is we're just speeding up a transition that's happening anyway. Does it really matter to put the electric cars on the road a little faster before they're really ready to get there and before we have power plants ready to power them than it does in 10 years? And Esteban is telling you not. So the only way out of this, from the carbon point of view, non-carbon electric technology must be cheaper. And nuclear, hydro, geothermal, capture and storage geoengineering can't be dirty words. Policy instead should focus on R&D. There are things that we can avoid, however, namely almost all of current US and EU policy, which I would describe as stop fossil fuel development domestically before our alternatives are available at scale, and then go begging to Venezuela and Iran when you run into trouble. Force electrification on an unready grid, subsidize today's technology, but only if they're built in the US with union labor. We can certainly avoid wasting huge amounts of money this way. And one example, the US just passed an Inflation Reduction Act with $369 billion to save the climate. Run through what they did to the UN's model, no right-wing model here, the UN's model. It will lower global temperatures by 0.0009 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can correct that to Celsius. That's just money down a rat hole. Why? Because most of what we're doing is crony capitalist protectionism. Green, but only if built in the US at union wages. We have big tariffs on Chinese solar panels. Now think about it in a moment. Does Mother Gaia care where the solar panels are made? She just wants them in. Show projects. My own state of California is building $100 billion for a, quote, high-speed train, which will save absolutely nothing in terms of climate. Economics. If only we did some serious cost-benefit analysis. I was supposed to talk about climate risk to the financial system. I will tell you only now that's a farce. And I will opine that the net zero, the carbon credits, are going to be the cryptocurrency of the next 2030. The same people are selling the same forests over and over again. As Esteban said, the main policy response will be new technology and adaptation. But for new technology, the one slightly critical thing is 100 years is a long time. And as the sea level rises a few millimeters per year, people will figure out that they need to build on higher ground, it takes 20 years to build a city, not 100 years. The time compression fallacy gets people. Let me admit, what do people say? Wait a minute, John, what about the tipping points? The unknowns. Maybe there's a disaster out there. Maybe, like our friend Wile E. Coyote, there's an anvil that might fall from the sky. Well, maybe, but maybe a piano might fall from the sky, or maybe an asteroid might fall from the sky. We cannot go out today and spend trillions of dollars on every hypothetical thing that might happen without some vague quantification. And here I worry that the obsession with climate has distracted us from real dangers and from real economic problems. If the question is identify out-of-the-box risks that imperil humanities and our societies, let's ask that question. And what are the dangers to civilization? Well, rather than a very slow, predictable rise in temperature and sea level, how about war? That can happen. How about civil wars? How about political chaos? Our societies coming unraveling? How about a global pandemic, a real one this time? Not one that kills 1% of the people, one that kills 30% of the people, like the plague did. How about a global crop failure? How about non-climate environmental problems? You know, trillions of dollars per year could do a lot, especially in poor countries, to eliminate bad weather, dirty air, infectious diseases that are currently killing lots of people, chemical pollution. I worry about species extinction. The rhinos will be gone 100 years from now, and they'll be gone because we shot them, not because the planet got warmer. How about non-climate uses of money? Health, development, a widely shared prosperity. How about $1 trillion? Do you want to spend $1 trillion on electric cars, or how about for cancer? We don't have trillions of dollars to waste. So if the question is identify out-of-box risks, climate change just doesn't answer that question. So last slide, what is the question to which our policies are the answer? We are economists, and we always like to think something's an optimal response. We just haven't figured out what's the optimal response to. Well, multiple choice test. Is it to improve world GDP 100 years from now in a sustainable way, to improve the welfare of poor and marginalized people? And no, because that's 99.99% standard growth and development. Is it to stop a predictable life on Earth threatening environmental calamity? No, that's nowhere in the science. Is it to address out-of-the-box unrecognized dangers? No, we just listed those. Climate isn't one of them. Are we trying to transition to a low-carbon economy at minimal cost? Maximal, maybe, but minimal none. So none of the above. Well, I think we can't escape the fact in the room. And if we want to do serious policy, it's politics. There's the mild in the US of protection, subsidies, party politics, get the money from you can. And let's recognize there's the great cause. People say climate justice, degrowth, end of capitalism. It's a whole new movement that has taken the logic seriously. They call themselves eco-authoritarians. You see, look, if the planet's going to burn in 10 years, we don't have time to let democracy take over or do it. We have to take over and ram it down their throats. Recognize that it has a lot of climate policy has become an almost religious cause with a political aim. And I think that if you recognize that fact, you can at least wall yourself off from, but also try to argue sensibly for what Esteban tells us, science and economics and objective truths. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much on really provocative ideas and points of view. Let's see, Esteban, do you want to reply to some of this first?
I think ultimately we're very much in agreement. I think there's two main things that I want to talk about. The first one is we need measurement, and we need to have the best possible measurement that we can put together. This is a phenomenon that is going to happen over many years. And so, you know, how can we get our best predictions? Well, by developing methodologies that allow us to think about how the world economy is going to look at in the future and the effect that climate change is going to have on that. Are we going to get that 100% right? Of course not. But, you know, that's the best we can do. And so that's the game. That's what we're doing, right? And if you can come up with a better way of doing that, great. but that progress in economics, and that's always been the way we think about policy in economics. Now, this is a tricky problem because it's over time and because it's so heterogeneous across space. And so, you know, that presents some challenges for sure. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that calculation. And then the other point that John made and that I'm very sympathetic to is, well, you know, how do we benchmark these costs? I mean, how big are they, right? And if we benchmark with 2% growth for a century, it's nothing. And I think we're all in agreement with that. And I think John illustrated that in a very, you know, precise and kind of stark way. But you know, the reality is that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have had a hard time growing at 2% per year for a century, right? And that a lot of countries overall have had a big problem in terms of generating that growth. And so obviously the growth problem is important. They should solve that problem. But if I suddenly tell you, well, on top of that, I'm going to hit you with 15% less GDP over the next 100 years, that's not going to help. I mean, that's particularly damaging for those places as well. So, you know, I think, yes, is it as big as finding the way to develop these countries? No. Is 15% of your economy over, you know, present discounted value something that we should worry about? I would say yes. And, you know, because obviously if the answer to that is no, then a lot of what we all do is something that we shouldn't be doing, right? I mean, this is much bigger than many of the things that we worry about in economics. Now, of course, you know, if the benchmark is reacting to the press that says the world is going to end in the next, you know, 50 years, then of course, this is nothing, right? And compared to that is nothing. So I think it's all about benchmarking it. And I think that's exactly why putting these numbers down and being precise about what these numbers actually are for the different places in the world is so important, so that we can exactly you know what we're talking about and know the magnitudes of what we're talking about.
In your talk and in your paper, you stress the importance of trade migration as well as technological changes. Try to bring these numbers down. Now, as you show in your work, climate change does not affect in the same way all the regions, and especially hits harder the poorer countries. So, and you also mentioned that you know, some of the measures that can be applied, like carbon taxing, that well, whether it has a global externality effect, it's something hard to control, or to impose taxes at the local or the national level to try to prevent these things. Also, given that, you know, the larger countries are probably less affected from climate change in terms of your numbers, and they're the ones who have the stronger or the greatest power in terms of setting policies at the international level of taxation as well as migration. Do you feel optimistic about any of this happening, or you feel that the numbers that you're providing us are actually a bit optimistic?
I think what we're seeing is, in particular in Europe, maybe California, that carbon pricing is being put in place. I think the problem with Europe is that it's also doing it together with carbon border adjustment tariffs. And I think those border adjustment tariffs are a big problem. I think that there's a lot of potential for capture, namely, you know, just use them as protectionist tools. And it's going to exactly hurt the countries that you don't want to hurt, because they are going to get the blunt of the problem. Namely, you know, when we go and try to impose carbon taxes in Europe, what we're seeing is that one of the big spillovers of that is you're changing specialization in Europe, and by changing specialization in Europe, you're actually hurting sub-Saharan Africa quite a lot. So that's another aspect of this. If we go unilaterally in certain particular regions, just say, well, we want to do it. We have our reasons. We have a political mandate to do certain policies. You go and do them. And then, that has consequences on other parts of the world. And I think our analysis is telling us, those consequences can be the worst for places in the world that are the ones that are going to be the worst affected by the phenomenon anyway. So that's a double effect on these countries. So I think we have to be really careful in thinking about those unintended consequences.
Let me ask you something, John. I take from your comments, or you're telling us is, the optimal level for an economic bad is not zero. No, certainly. And in this case, when you compare the costs of climate change with, as you say, with the benefits of growth, well, they look tiny. Now, in spite of this, we are seeing now currently a lot of pressure from the financial sector, from institutional investors, for companies either to adopt technologies that, say, it will happen anyways, or otherwise just increasing the cost of capital for environmental issues as well as other, ESG in general. So what's your take on this?
Well, I don't mind if people do with their money what they want to do with their money. So if it makes them feel good to do that, that's wonderful. I do mind when that's pressured inappropriately by the government. In particular, because the general plan of we need to stop fossil fuel development right now is not a wise plan. And especially the plan is we need to stop fossil fuel development in the United States, where it's done with proper environmental standards, which results in just being done somewhere else, is not a wise plan. So what I think is a big mistake is what's going on now. The effort by central banks and financial regulators to force these kinds of things onto the banking system under the guise of, there's a pretense of climate financial risk, which is just ludicrous. Nothing in nothing in any of the science says that in the horizon we can look at the financial system, which is at best 5 years, that anything could happen to the probability distribution of the weather to bring down the financial system. That's just crazy. And transition risk, the probability, now it's more likely that legislatures will screw things up. But we've just seen what happens. They said that, the efforts to get rid of fossil fuel will bankrupt the fossil fuel companies. No, stopping investment in fossil fuels means that the profits of the existing people go up. They got the sign wrong on that one. This is just a subterfuge to allow financial regulators to do what legislators will not do, which is to turn off fossil fuels before we have storage in particular, but a robust non-fossil fuel electrical system ready. And it won't do anything for the climate, and it will really harm the economy. So that aspect of it seems to me like a big mistake and part of the politics. If you don't go on to be a toast of Davos by being a central banker and getting margin requirements right, you'd be the toast of Davos by leading on climate change where legislators won't go. Some of it is actually healthy, though. So there's a lot of greenwashing. Oh, we're the great ESG fund and we do all sorts of wonderful things. Oh, are you really? To some extent, the people who ask for regulation are going to get a big dose of what they asked for and be sorry, because then the emptiness of most of this will be revealed if it comes out. So it's part of the politics part. It won't do anything for the climate. It will, if it keeps going, screw up energy markets and make things more expensive, hurt GDP now at the cost of a lot of politics.
I agree. I think when we overall, just to kind of conclude, I think the key issue about pricing and the incentives for investments, in particular funds, the key is all to direct it to innovation so that we find better ways to produce energy that don't hurt the environment without destroying or without affecting the economy in unnecessarily bad ways today. I think that's the key. And the reality is that if you just jack up the price or you put restrictions etc. It's just going to be very, very hard to do. And that's kind of related to that point that John was making about this delaying of the effect of the carbon tax, just delaying. And so at the end of the day, the big issue to me is, how do we create these incentives? How do we make in the firms and governments direct resources towards green energy and, you know, trying to develop better technologies on this without doing it by just imposing a very high price of fossil fuels today, which is gonna, you know, have a potentially very large cost for the economy. And so I think that's kind of the finding policy solutions to that seems important. And it's not obvious to me that the ones that we have right now on the table are super effective in achieving that.
If I could add to that just briefly, there's a lot of getting out of the way we can do. In the United States, if you want to build a solar farm and then build a transmission line to connect to the grid, it's going to take you 15 years to get the permits to do the darn thing. Well, you know, Mother Gaia is sitting there hurting for another 15 years. A lot of climate is about zoning. You can't build houses near where people work. Well, that's a lot better than electric cars. And by enshrining today's technology with massive subsidies, who knows what the right technology is going to be? Maybe it's electric cars, maybe it's hydrogen-powered cars. We should be in an era of fast experimentation with all sorts of different ideas, rather than going and getting your subsidies for doing it one way. And the protectionism gets in the way. We should be installing solar panels faster. Well, you have to pay a tariff to get the thing in from China. I know from experience, getting the permits to install solar panels in Palo Alto is a harrowing process that takes years. Forget it. We didn't get the solar panels because we couldn't get the permits and they jacked up the prices. So just some regular getting out of the way and encouraging the entrepreneurial spirit would do a lot in this transition.
Well, thank you very much. I guess we'll keep talking about this for eons, but we have run out of time. So thank you very much, both of you, Esteban, John. Thank you for joining from Palo Alto. Esteban, thank you especially for making the trip down from Chicago. Thank you very much. Y bueno, con eso terminamos nuestro seminario. Creo que ha sido un seminario fascinante, exitoso. Yo me voy con un cierto sentido de optimismo moderado respecto a las perspectivas del país para este año y el mundo en general. Espero, pero realmente un agradecimiento a todo el equipo del ITAM que hizo posible este evento, y de una manera muy especial a todos nuestros participantes, nuestros panelistas que realmente enriquecieron nuestra forma de pensar, nuestros conocimientos. Y a todos ustedes les agradezco enormemente su atención. Les deseo a todos un muy próspero y exitoso año de 2023. Que el mundo se componga un poquitín y nos permita que nuestros sueños se hagan realidad. Muchísimas gracias. Muy buen provecho a todos.